The mind never stops talking, even when the room is silent, even when nothing is happening, even when you are exhausted. There is always a voice, commenting, predicting, judging, repeating. And most people spend their entire lives believing that voice is who they are. That is the real problem. Not the thoughts themselves, not anxiety, not overthinking, not confusion. The problem is identification. You have confused yourself with the noise in your head. And once that happens, your entire life starts being controlled by mental activity you never consciously chose. Think about it. A thought appears in your mind. I'm not good enough. And immediately, your body reacts as if it were true. Another thought appears. What if I fail? Now your energy changes. Your emotions change. Your behavior changes. But here is what most people never realize. The thought arrived on its own. You did not sit down and consciously decide to create fear. You did not intentionally choose insecurity. You did not deliberately generate doubt. It appeared, automatically. And yet you accepted it as reality. This is where suffering begins for many people, not because they think negative thoughts. Every human mind produces contradictory thoughts. The suffering begins when the mind becomes the unquestioned authority, when every thought is treated as truth, when every emotion becomes identity, when mental noise becomes self-definition. What you have to understand is that the mind is a tool, an extraordinary tool, a necessary tool, but a terrible master. The mind analyzes, compares, predicts, protects, repeats patterns. That is its function. But somewhere along the way, you were conditioned to believe that the constant voice in your head was your actual self. And because of that, you started living inside mental loops instead of conscious awareness. Now stay with me here. If you can observe your thoughts, then there must be something beyond the thoughts doing the observing. Read that again internally. If you can notice fear, then fear cannot be your deepest identity. If you can witness anxiety, then anxiety is not the core of who you are. If you can hear the mental noise, then you are not the noise. You are the awareness behind it. This changes everything once you truly see it, because most people spend years trying to fight the mind. They try to eliminate thoughts, control every emotion, force positivity, suppress negativity, but that approach usually creates more tension. Why? Because the mind becomes stronger when you treat every thought as an emergency. The moment you become afraid of your own thinking, the mind gains more control over your emotional state. And this creates a cycle. A thought creates emotion. The emotion reinforces the thought. The reinforced thought creates more emotion, and eventually the pattern feels permanent. This is why people often say, "I don't know why I feel stuck. I keep repeating the same reactions. I know better, but I still feel the same." Because knowledge alone does not dissolve identification. You can intellectually understand these ideas and still remain emotionally trapped inside the mind. The shift happens when observation becomes stronger than reaction. Think about someone standing beside a busy road. Cars pass constantly, some loud, some fast, some chaotic, but the person watching the traffic is not the traffic. Your thoughts work the same way. Some thoughts are useful, some are irrational, some are old conditioning replaying itself. But awareness remains separate from all of them. The truth is, most thoughts are repetitions, old fears, old memories, old assumptions, old emotional patterns. The mind recycles familiar material because familiarity feels safe to the nervous system. Even painful patterns can feel psychologically comfortable when they are known. That is why people repeat emotional experiences they claim they no longer want. Not because they consciously desire suffering, but because the subconscious mind prioritizes familiarity over transformation. This is also why external success alone rarely creates inner peace. Someone can change jobs, relationships, cities, routines, and still carry the same internal chaos everywhere they go, because the mind traveled with them. Most people are trying to change their life without understanding the mechanism creating their experience. Your internal state shapes the way you interpret reality. Two people can experience the exact same situation and emotionally live inside completely different worlds. One sees rejection, another sees redirection. One sees failure, another sees feedback. One sees uncertainty, another sees possibility. The event is not the full experience. The interpretation completes the experience. And interpretation comes from conditioning. This is why awareness matters so much. Because awareness interrupts automatic interpretation. The moment you observe a thought, instead of instantly becoming it, space appears. And in that space, something powerful begins to happen. Choice. Real choice. Not automatic reaction. Not emotional compulsion. Not unconscious repetition. Choice. For many people, this feels unfamiliar at first, because they have spent years reacting immediately to every internal movement. A stressful thought appears. The body tightens. Emotion rises. Behavior follows. The entire sequence happens automatically, but awareness slows the process down. You begin noticing the pattern while it is happening. And that moment of noticing is already transformation beginning. Not because your life instantly changes, not because all negative thinking disappears, but because consciousness entered the pattern. And unconscious patterns cannot survive long under sustained awareness. Let that sink in. Many of the emotions you experience daily are not coming from the present moment. They are echoes. Old emotional signatures repeating themselves through familiar thoughts. This is why the mind often becomes loudest when life becomes still. Silence exposes unresolved internal noise. When distractions disappear, people finally hear what has been running in the background the entire time. And sometimes that realization feels uncomfortable, but discomfort is not failure. It is exposure. You are becoming aware of what was already there. That awareness is necessary, because you cannot change patterns you refuse to see clearly. Now, this does not mean you should judge yourself for having negative thoughts. That only creates another layer of conflict. The goal is not perfection. The goal is consciousness. There is a major difference. A conscious person can still experience fear without becoming consumed by it. A conscious person can still feel sadness without defining themselves by it. A conscious person can still hear mental noise without obeying every command the mind produces. This is emotional freedom, not the absence of thoughts, not permanent happiness. Freedom means the mind no longer controls your identity. And once this begins happening, your relationship with yourself changes completely. You stop treating every thought like a personal truth. You stop assuming every emotion predicts reality. You stop building your identity around temporary mental states. Instead, you begin observing with more calm, more distance, more clarity. And strangely enough, this often makes the mind quieter naturally, because resistance feeds mental noise. Observation weakens it. Think about quicksand. People panic and fight harder, which pulls them deeper. The mind often works similarly. The more aggressively you fight every thought, the more entangled you become in mental struggle. But awareness changes the relationship entirely. You begin seeing thoughts as mental events instead of permanent truths. That distinction matters more than most people realize, because your life follows the emotional states you repeatedly identify with. If you constantly identify with fear, limitation begins shaping your decisions. If you constantly identify with lack, scarcity starts influencing perception. If you constantly identify with insecurity, your behavior slowly adapts around self-protection. Identity directs attention. Attention directs behavior. Behavior shapes experience. This is why inner work matters. Not as a trend, not as performance, not as spiritual decoration, but because the quality of your consciousness affects the quality of your life. And this is where everything changes. Once you stop seeing yourself as the mind, you stop feeling trapped by every passing thought. You begin realizing that awareness itself is stable, even when emotions are unstable. There is a quieter place underneath the noise. Most people sense this occasionally, maybe during deep presence, maybe in nature, maybe during complete stillness, maybe during moments when thinking suddenly stops for a few seconds. And in those moments, there is relief, not because life became perfect, but because the mental commentary paused. For a brief moment, you experienced yourself without the constant filter of compulsive thinking. That peace is not something you create artificially. It is something you uncover. It was already there beneath the noise. The mind is loud because it was conditioned to survive, to scan for danger, to predict outcomes, to maintain familiar identity structures. But awareness does not need to scream. It simply observes, calmly, clearly, without force. And the more connected you become to that awareness, the less controlled you become by temporary mental storms. This does not happen overnight. Years of conditioning do not disappear instantly. But every moment of observation weakens unconscious identification a little more. Every time you notice the mind without becoming consumed by it, something shifts internally. You reclaim energy. You reclaim presence. You reclaim choice. And slowly, life starts feeling different. Not because the external world suddenly transformed, but because you are no longer experiencing reality entirely through unconscious mental noise. This is the beginning of real inner change. Not forcing positivity, not pretending everything is fine, not denying human emotion. Real change begins when awareness becomes stronger than automatic identification. When you finally understand, the mind is speaking, but that voice is not your deepest self. You are the one hearing it. And once you truly see that, the noise loses much of its power, because you stop feeding it with unconscious belief. You stop building your identity out of temporary thoughts. You stop living as a prisoner of mental repetition. Instead, you begin returning to presence, again and again. And that return changes the direction of your entire life. If this message connected with something you've been feeling internally, subscribe to the channel and continue exploring these ideas with us. There's another video here that will help you understand why the patterns you keep repeating are not random, and what finally begins to break them.